Okay, it is 10 o'clock Eastern time, and Cheryl is anxious to get going here. I want to welcome everybody who is joining us for this very important event in the MCM students' journey. The thing that they hear about on their first day. And Cheryl, I remember you in that room. We were in the MDCL Center, and everybody was nervous, and you could hear about this, and people started asking about Capstone. What does that look like? And we'd say, don't worry, it'll happen. And I'm so very glad that we are here today to help you take it across the finish line. And I want to thank her supervisor, Jackie Hornweg, for helping her guide Cheryl along this journey as well. And welcome all those other MCM students who are tuning in to see what that capstone experience looks like as well. So just to remind everybody, I'm Cheryl's second reader, but I'm also the chair of this session as the director of the program. And this is a pretty formal process. Cheryl will have 25 minutes, and I will time it to present her findings from this research study she has engaged in. And then we will go through a round of questions where Jackie, as your supervisor, will lead off, and then I will follow as well. If we have exhausted our questions, we'll then, and time permitting, we'll then open the door to anyone else that might have questions, and they should stay relevant to the capstone research, not asking her, so where are you going now? Are you going to Disney to celebrate or anything like that? No, that won't work. And then Jackie and I will leave the discussion. You can then extend your own congratulations and best wishes to Cheryl at that point, and we'll talk about what this means to her, and then we'll come back and render our final decision. So without further ado, Cheryl, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. I'm really happy to be here to be presenting my master's research entitled School of Hard Knocks, exploring how and to what extent leaders in Ontario colleges and universities balance the reputational benefits and risks associated with contact intercollegiate sports. So here's me at the bottom of the stairs there, about to guide us through the research problem and questions, take a look at a couple themes in the literature review, explain my methodology, but then spend most of our time on some results and analysis and some practical recommendations. As a point of housekeeping, throughout the presentation, I'm going to make reference to the term higher education institution, and I'm going to do so just by using the short form HEI. So you'll hear that throughout the presentation. So I thought I'd start just by sharing a little bit of the path that led me to think about this research. And it began a couple years ago. I was actually listening to a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell, and he was talking about the threshold of evidence that human beings need in order to take action. And his thesis was that for many reasons, people often prefer a state of inaction, even to their own detriment. And through my learnings in MCM, I also came to realize that organizations also struggled with this phenomenon of inaction sometimes. And that caused me to reflect on my employer. I'm very fortunate to work for an HEI that has a reputation for both research and athletic excellence. So I was curious about how responsive they were. And also from a communications lens, I was curious about how they're listening to their stakeholders in a changing environment, especially considering this growing body of research around concussions. So I started off by looking to the US, and I found this report from the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges that said there is a perception of a widening gap between athletics and academic culture. And they said that this gap exists because there's a lack of accountability in athletics. And they said that this is happening and that the public is watching, and failures in this area are adding to the erosion of trust in higher education. So I was curious, from a Canadian lens, do these same kinds of tensions exist? We know that the HEI environment in Canada is competitive, and so finding a point of competitive differentiation is important, and athletic identity may be something that we leverage to do that. I also know that there have been personal injury lawsuits in this country related to intercollegiate sports. There have been media stories that have scrutinized certain schools and organizations for the way that they balance health versus performance outcomes with their student athletes. And we've had the emergence of Rowan's Law. So this piece of legislation that's come about in Ontario, born from both public and political interest in the way that we are managing concussions, particularly among young people. So with that context in mind, it led me to identify my research problem, which is how do schools in Ontario balance the reputational benefits and risks associated with contact intercollegiate sports? And I was able to study this through 3 sub-questions. So RQ1 was looking at how and to what extent does intercollegiate sports serve the mission of the HEI and inform its identity. RQ2 was looking at how and to what extent are HEI athletic leaders in Ontario responding to stakeholder and societal expectations about the value and risk in contact intercollegiate sports. And then how and to what extent do leaders define, assess, and measure risk. So that was my 3rd RQ. So to begin, I conducted a literature review, and I'm just going to quickly touch on a couple themes that I think might be relevant to our discussion today. So there is no single definition of reputation, but we know that it's about a relationship that forms between an organization and its stakeholders. And the relationship is actually based on a collective system of beliefs that stakeholders have about the organization. And the reason that this matters is because those relationships translate into supportive behavior towards the organization, and that becomes a point of competitive advantage. Now, in HEIs, it's been said that athletic values and academic values can create dual identities that can coexist in schools. Now, Fombrun and Van Riel would say that conflicting values and identities are a problem. They're a liability because they can muddy the water and sort of impact the way that stakeholders understand the organization. But Veras disagrees and says that public organizations have to represent diverse public interests and should actually be embracing conflicting values and interests as opposed to trying to sacrifice one over the other. Now, historically, when it came to sports, the perspective was that nobody cares about anything else except winning. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's not entirely the case. And even sports organizations have to act in a certain way to manage issues and avoid crisis. And they do this by conducting environmental scanning and analysis to help them identify warning signs in their environment and then enabling them to respond appropriately. But the catch is that that response can be really hard because it might be some kind of action that goes against the culture of the organization. And so the default is that organizations may choose to do nothing, kind of like what Malcolm Gladwell was talking about, that we find ourselves in a state of stasis. The data also suggests that the public thinks that college sports organizations haven't done enough to address issues of concussions in sports, in the United States at least. But Kramer and Sanderson say the public is actually a bit split on this topic. Some think that we need more protections in place while others don't, and that's for a variety of reasons. And so sports organizations should expect a certain degree of resistance if they plan on implementing changes and policies that change the way that stakeholders will experience sport, even if it's simply to address this issue of concussion risk. So with this literature as a foundation, I developed a methodology to investigate the research problem. So I sent an anonymous survey to the 27 athletic directors of the Ontario College Athletic Association, and I had 5 respondents, which represents 18.5% of that population. I conducted in-depth interviews with 9 directors of athletics and deans who were responsible for student wellness from 7 universities and colleges in Ontario. And the interviewees were identified through convenience sampling and just based on my professional network and through HEI websites. And then I also did a content analysis of the mission, vision, and value statements of the institutions that were represented in the interview population. And these statements were all publicly available and were accessed through the school's websites. And that's actually where I'm going to start, is just taking a look at this MVV analysis. So to understand how varsity athletics supports the mission and contributes to identity in HEIs, I built this model to help establish some common principles of identity across all of the institutions that were represented. And the initial analysis found that there was 3 common components, which were principles, actions, and outcomes. And then after arranging that content into those categories, further analysis identified 6 common variables, which were ethics, innovation, collaboration, scholarship, distinction, and excellence. So you can see that ethics is a principle, innovation, collaboration, and scholarship are actions, distinction is an outcome, and then excellence is both a principle and an outcome. So my model here shows that how schools are representing themselves. And this also acted as a framework to help compare some of the data from the survey and the interviews. So as Christian and Gornick suggested, the schools in my study did convey themselves as moral institutions that act to advance goals that align with societal standards. And I see this phenomena was clear in the way that schools described how integrity and accountability inform how innovation is achieved. And that was through critical thinking and challenging the known world and being receptive to changes. So that's kind of the baseline that I was able to establish. The next finding I want to share was about reputation influence. So 80% of my survey participants believed that athletics influences perceptions about the school overall. Interviewees said that they do this by building relationships and creating visibility and helping the school communicate their values. Now, one of the things that I identified in my introduction was this potential gap in athletics and academic values, in American schools at least. So I was curious about what this value alignment looked like in Ontario schools. And what I found was that 80% of the survey respondents said that values were aligned. But when I talked to my interview participants, the degree of alignment seemed to vary between institutions and was impacted by 2 primary factors. The first factor was this proximity to or relationships with curricular programs and services. So athletic programs that work really closely with academic partners or who are actually positioned right inside an academic faculty seem to report the highest degree of value alignment and the least amount of tension with academics. The second factor with this sort of value alignment concept was coaches. So specifically, coaching staff's ability to internalize and then reflect institutional mission was important. So when coaches were able to do this at every level of their coaching practice, from athlete recruitment to internal team culture to promoting a balance between academic and athletic performance, overall value alignment seemed to increase. Now, this actually contributes to a broader theme that emerged about coaches, which is that they are critical to athlete experience, and value alignment and reputation outcomes more broadly for the school, but the degree of oversight that HEIs implement and how coaches were managed was inconsistent. And I think the landscape is nicely summarized by participant H, who said that coaches are critical to athlete protection and critical to athletes' focus on academics, but they're also the biggest risk. So in terms of recommendations, if the intention here is around enhancing value alignment, HEIs should look at how athletics is structured within the institution and think about creating more touch points with curricular programming. Now, lots of schools are doing this really well. I heard about lots of athlete scholar programs, enhancing academic accommodation for athletes, academic ombudsman, tracking first-year students really closely in terms of their academic performance. So there are a lot of models there to emulate, but it might be even more than that. It might be about the need to bring in more academic representation right into athletic policy development and essentially giving academic faculty a seat at the table. Schools also need to formalize their approach to coach management. So here my suggestions are around creating an onboarding program that emphasizes and incentivizes the adoption and reflection of HEI mission and values. There also needs to be regular oversight conducted and regular assessment of coaches. And where it doesn't exist already, the development of a code of conduct that can support the values and also reflect the known risks that HEIs have identified. The study also found that there is an insular culture that informs athletics. And we saw this in that decision-making was influenced primarily by the priorities of internal stakeholders, or those who are from a sports organization. So athletes, HEI leadership, and athletic associations were perceived to have the most influence. Now, this approach might be really good at promoting that better connection to the institutional mission, which is important, but it might leave schools vulnerable to some blind spots regarding perceptions and values of external stakeholders. particularly because the data also showed that environmental scanning practices were fairly limited, with very few participants using a full scope of environmental assessment tools or techniques. I think here participant E articulates the situation fairly succinctly and saying that varsity sports is very insular and there's not a ton of influence from the outside. And I heard that kind of vocabulary throughout the study. Things like silos, barriers, insular, keeping things within the team, keeping things within the athletics, that kind of thing. There was also an acknowledgement that culturally, athletics struggles with a bit of tension between tradition and evidence. Right, so tradition being sort of inside sport and evidence being new information coming from outside sport. And participant A says here, education and sciences are making us question things we've always done and why we continue to do these long-standing practices simply because we've always done them. Now, there was also some expression about a desire to change in order to help better serve our schools and our students. But change was perceived to be hard because things like toughness and surmounting risk was something that was celebrated and entrenched in sport culture. Also, during the interviews, I found that participants often talked or shared their personal experiences in sport, either as an athlete or a coach or a parent of an athlete, and they used those stories sometimes to describe the problem solving in their professional work. And so it might be that those personal experiences and that personal affinity for sport that has been informed by that sport culture of tradition that we've identified may actually go on and continue to shape decisions in HEIs as well and continue to perpetuate some of those traditions. Similarly, high school sports and minor sports that were just described to me to be conducted by volunteers who were primarily from an era where risk was not as critically scrutinized, at least not as critically as it is in HEIs. The actions there tended to influence what happened in HEIs as well. So as it was described to me as, you start at the minor sport level and you become entrenched in its culture and its practices, and then you bring those expectations and those practices with you as you move into HEIs. And so I think the takeaway here is that this culture and this lens and these influences may limit the understanding of external perceptions and changing perceptions, especially because we know new information can emerge really quickly. And there's a potential here to be surprised by or vulnerable to untracked changes in the environment. Now, the data also suggested that there was a bit of self-recognition about this insular culture and a recognition of a need to change. As participant A said, we need to invite people from outside the sports sector to help us navigate these times because it's shifting very, very quickly. In terms of recommendations, I think it's about, again, expanding the stakeholder assessment and considering very simply, what do influential non-fans think about this? More proactive data collection on our stakeholders. I found that the participants were really good at doing this with athletes. And so there was a real desire and lots of different ways that they were trying to get information from their student athletes. So they need to use that kind of approach with other stakeholders as well. There's also a need to expand the environmental scanning practice and use sort of broader techniques there. And also a need to increase diversity in leadership. So looking at bringing non-athletics people and experiences in to help navigate these times, as was said. The next finding I wanted to share was about perceptions of risk. So I asked participants to reflect on concussion injuries. And here I was trying to better understand their sense of risk assessment and measurement. And what I found was that half of my participants said that concussion injuries were a reputation risk, whereas the other half, 5 of the interviewees, said that athletes' health is actually a really low risk issue because there are lots of safeguards embedded in varsity sports to protect their health, and that their health is really well supervised by lots of different stakeholders, and so it's a low risk issue. However, generally speaking, the larger institutions in the study perceived this issue as a greater risk. So for example, in my interview population, 2 of the 3 institutions that had football programs acknowledged the reputation risk around that sport due to the prevalence of concussion. But only one of those leaders had actually raised that concern with the university. Participant C said, "I'm always very wary about football. This isn't just me. I've voiced this to senior members of our faculty and the university. I really question whether as a post-secondary institution we should have football. It's not a sport where you can modify the rules to take out the danger, and we know the potential for lifelong injury is there. For me, that's one of those structural, cultural flags that's always up. Now, she went on to say that despite that concern, there wasn't an appetite to change football or programming at her school. And this was consistent, as most of the interviewees said that participation decline would be the main trigger for any kind of change, because participation numbers were seen to be this clear, clean, unbiased metric that could be used to assess a sport's viability. And at this stage, they just hadn't witnessed a shift in those numbers. Now, despite that mixed opinion on the risk, all participants acknowledged an increase in public awareness about concussion risk, but felt that awareness hadn't sort of resulted in a change in behavior. Participant C said, "I'm not seeing the outside perspective changing very much at all. Rowan's Law is not having an impact. I sit in our football or hockey stadiums and all the parents and everybody cheers for the big hits. It's still a celebration of toughness." So we also discussed a hypothetical worst case scenario. And here I was looking to understand how leaders thought stakeholders would react and the institution's level of responsibility if an athlete suffered a catastrophic concussion injury while playing varsity sports for their school. And what emerged in the data was this definition of reputation risk in athletics and HEIs, which was when the institution acts in a way that puts the athlete at risk beyond what is inherent in sport. And I think that this definition informed the degree of responsibility and the anticipated reaction to this worst case scenario. So the first quote here from participant E says, "It's ridiculous to assume that it's the institution's responsibility to protect every last student athlete. Should we wrap them in bubble wrap? Unfortunately, it's part of sport." Now, on the other side, participant A said that if an athlete were severely injured, it would lead to a discussion about where universities fit in those sports and the key function of the university versus that sport. And it goes back to concerns around commercialization of sports and those pressure points and where it fits within student leadership development and personal development. So the takeaway here is that there isn't a consensus, I think, on concussion as a reputation risk, and that this definition of risk may identify a bit of a separation in terms of the institution's responsibility from the actions of the sport itself. And this goes to align a little bit with the literature review in stating that perceptions are mixed on this topic. And the study shows that they're mixed, these perceptions are mixed even within this athletic leadership population. So in terms of recommendations, I think that it might be worth reflecting on this definition in case, certain schools or HEIs have a sense of invulnerability, right? And have this sense of separation, that the school and the sport are separate. Because we know that what Coombs says is that if a crisis happens, the public will do one of two things. They will either blame the situation, but they may also blame the organization. And from a communications perspective, we need to be prepared for that. And I think part of this sort of strategic assessment that needs to be conducted will be taking a page from Larkin, who tells us that we have to reflect on whether or not our actions deliver the values that we are claiming. And I think there's an opportunity here also to lean into some of that MVV analysis that I shared to help with that. Again, these activities are not designed to criticize or pass judgment on certain sports or activities or schools. That's not it at all. It's just meant to evaluate the landscape with the goal of protecting and enhancing reputation in our schools. So as a practical takeaway, I packaged these recommendations into a 12-point self-assessment questionnaire for athletic leaders that addressed sort of 5 key categories. The first one was environmental scanning. So questions here were about helping to broaden stakeholder and environmental assessment practices. The second category was diversity and transparency in decision-making. So here I was looking, finding out ways how we can bring outside perspectives into decision-making and also look at how we share problem solving outside of athletics. And then governance, training, and assessment was questions about sort of considering the structure of athletics and also looking at how certain key stakeholders are managed in our HEIs. And then in addition to that, I also had some points about legal protection that came up in the study, and also a point about what is our responsibility outside of the HEI, and looking and trying to understand, is there an opportunity here to use our position to influence behavior at the minor sport level? Because I think we're starting to understand that it can have an impact for us as well. And in terms of helping to mobilize the knowledge, I think that if I had the opportunity of presenting some of these findings within a sports organization, a body like the OCAA, or at an HEI conference, this would be a great takeaway to help support a program conduct an audit on themselves, or to help leaders begin to facilitate a conversation with their administrative and their leadership teams, right? Because we know that sometimes having those conversations can be difficult. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much. I'm actually just going to very, very quickly take the opportunity to say thank you to my phenomenal supervisor, Jackie Hornwig, for all of her guidance and her advice and her cheerleading through this research process. She is someone that I really admire, and I really hope to emulate as I move forward in my career and my life. So Jackie, thank you so much for your help. And to Chris, my husband, who is just one of the most positive and supportive partners a student could ask for. So couldn't have got here without you. So thank you.
Well said, Cheryl.
Thanks.
And thank you to both Jackie and Chris and your entire network, your MCM cohort, for helping you get to this point as well. So now we'll start the round of questions. So this is the oral defense of the Capstone research as well. So Jackie, the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you. So once I wipe those tears away from my eyes, I'm very touched. Thank you, Cheryl. Such a pleasure and so much learning on my part. You took a topic here that is complicated, and there was a lot to unpack, and just phenomenal job doing that today. So first of all, thank you for that. It was so great. There's a few things that I want to touch on, but the first thing I thought maybe I would do is just go to that definition of risk, that, the beyond inherent risk. And if you were talking to an institution who really has said that this is how they articulate that, is that what they're responsible for is that what's beyond inherent sport. And you captured a lot of this very well already. Is there anything else that you would like to say in terms of managing reputation when your definition of risk is this?
I think that this is a bit of a myopic lens on risk, and this separation of responsibility is limited. In terms of managing reputation, you need to have a good sense of what your stakeholders' expectations are. And so this may be what your expectation of risk is, but this may not be what the expectation of risk looks like for your stakeholders. So I think that if this is the approach that a school is adopting, then they need to consider doing a little bit more stakeholder analysis and try to have a more complete understanding of what the opinions are of those around them that may have the ability to dissent against this, I guess you could say. And if they felt strongly enough, they could actually impact your institution's ability to achieve their sort of institutional objectives. So there's a value in considering the broader perspective here, because we know that if we aren't able to meet our stakeholders' expectations, there is likely to be a reputation decline, which will have a broader impact on the institution.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. The other thing I thought maybe if you could do is just go back to the model that you created.
Sure.
And just walk us through a little bit more on that, and just some of your thoughts, where that came from, and, in talking with the, how this resonated, first of all, where some of this came from, but also how the interviews and what you heard resonated in creating this.
Sure. So when I started the process, you have this big vast amount of text basically that you're dealing with. And so, you know, I was able to tackle this by looking for themes in the data and doing some matching and some highlighting, I guess you could say. And through that process, a few of these themes seem to emerge. At first, I was concerned that maybe I was just restating what mission, vision, and values stated by calling them principles, actions, and outcomes. But I felt like it helped me sort of understand the structure of MVV a little bit better. So once I had that structure and sort of understood like the underpinnings to it, and kind of could almost see it as like a bit of a trajectory, like you have the principles that informs your actions, that informs your outcomes. And then I was able to sort of hone in on some of these further sort of categories that emerged. And it was interesting in that there was a lot of consistency, right, across these categories. Looking at the way even in colleges, right, you would think colleges might not be so focused on scholarship, but the term scholarship is about, you know, the way that I've described it there, teaching and research and knowledge and discovery. That those were all themes that were very authentic to all of the schools that were in the study. And then the way that I heard this sort of reflected back to me in the interviews was the fact that these things all come together and they form the way that the institutions are trying to promote personal development and personal growth and leadership for their students. And so I heard that again and again, and so many of the informed, they feel that particularly collaboration and distinction and excellence seem to emerge as key themes in athletics. And where I felt like they might conflict or they might have a little bit of tension is in that space about innovation and critical thinking and being really open and receptive to changes. That was one point of tension that I heard through the interview process. They're very interested in being distinct oftentimes, but also obviously leaning into themes around teamwork and partnerships and being known. Again, that's back to being distinction. But again, that piece about critical thinking and being flexible and open to change, that was maybe one point that I felt that wasn't aligning as well from an athletics perspective as it was from like this sort of broad identity pillars perspective.
Thank you. I do have one more question, but I want to turn it over to Terry and give him a chance.
We'll do another
maybe
round.
I can come back to it.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. First of all, Cheryl, congratulations. And well-researched and conceptualized study. I mean, you've certainly grounded this in empirical evidence to build a story. And I like how you've made that point of differentiation with respect to most of the leading research in this area comes from the United States. And of course, that's a different game.
Yeah.
Totally. Having taught in the United States at a big university, you understand and you feel the influence of these sports institutions, not just on reputation, but on financial impact of the organization. And I think it's a timely one. I think how you've contextualized it in concussion is, one issue. You could have done it on many different areas. Today at McMaster, you could look at it in terms of how the university has dealt with Black people of color athletes, and look historically and not too different in the future, the impact of coaching on culture within the organization as well. So a couple fundamental questions I want to ask you as well. In terms of limitations, because you've done a model and you've built a model, but your response size for your survey is pretty small.
Yeah. And
you spoke to 9 directors within that university and college sector, which I assume you would agree are very uniquely different. And again, depending on whom you spoke to in the university sector, because there's a great disparity between,
Mhm.
not just research intensive universities, but, universities that do huge research and huge athletics as well. So can you just talk to me about those limitations in terms of how those have shaped your findings and to what degree your own personal experience or biases may have impacted this?
Sure. I mean, I recognize what the literature says, and there's possibility that I am bringing a personal bias here as well. I work for an HEI, like I said, that has a reputation for athletics performance. I have experience in competitive athletics myself. There is a potential here to bring in outside perspectives into the research, but I did my best with a concept of awareness, right? That trying my best to keep those pieces at play or at bay and focusing on what the data was showing me. I recognize what you're saying in that there is limitations, especially with the survey results. I had the intention of having a much bigger sample size from that Ontario College Athletic Directors or Athletic Association population pool. But I think that I was more heavily relying on the data from the interviews, and we're simply using some of the survey as a comparison, right? So I felt like it wasn't sort of the primary piece of data that I was leaning into for this analysis. It was a point of reflection and comparison to guide the research. So, and you're right in saying that universities and colleges are different entities. I found, this wasn't an area that I dove into or articulated in the report, but, there could be a whole study just on that, right? Just on their perspectives, even from simple things as the size of an athletic department. I believe there's a chance that it impacts the way that they manage risk, right? So for colleges, for example, my perception is that the management structure is quite small and they're not supported by a deep hierarchy. And so the person who is the leader of athletics, they have to lead, they have to provide the strategic direction, but they are also the ones who are fighting the fires 24/7. And so they're constantly dealing with issues management and don't have a lot of protected time to collect information, communicate, and sort of strategically approach how to lessen the impact of issues management. And that is something that I feel like was amplified in the college space. Whereas for a couple of the research intensive universities that were in this study, their structure was quite different, and I felt that it was reflective in the data, and it could have been for a number of different reasons. It could be that big institutions simply have a bigger reputation to manage, like that they have a bigger responsibility to safeguard that reputation, and so they strategically create positions that are designed to do that, and they have the resources, both financial and human resources, to support that. And it could just be that, research intensives, for example, take a different approach or have a different lens to issues management. So I absolutely recognize what you're saying, and I think that it is a totally valid point that the study tried to sort of bring in a common group, a common population to sort of tease out some of these issues. But within that population, there are lots of different sort of subcategories that could definitely warrant more exploration for sure.
I liked your slide where you highlighted participant E versus A. If you can go to that. That was the one that Jack's talked about, risk. Now the other one with your risk definition.
Okay, yep, sorry. Yeah.
So wait a second, I just lost you full screen. There we are. So from my look at that, if I saw that quote, I would see a dinosaur versus somebody that is struggling to make changes within a institution, but also within a culture that doesn't like in-tribe conflict, right? From that. So yeah, from your research, were you able to ascertain whether those were institutions that had experienced a reputation risk issue crisis, had different ways of thinking about it today? Or is it, we react and we respond and then we try to make some changes, but then we go back to this sort of participant E world?
So I can tell you that participant A had lived recently through a reputation issue. And that may have informed their perspective on this in this area. Participant E had not recently lived through that same kind of experience, but had been in close proximity to it, and acknowledged certain things that had happened in the landscape fairly recently. Participant E, for example, that participant also had some more experience in the American system, and so and again was somebody who was reflecting very much on what their personal experiences were in sport, and I found that informed that interview quite a lot. Whereas with participant A, I found that a little bit less. Sorry, Terry, I might be getting off track of what your question was.
No. I just, in terms of knowing those kind of differences, in terms of the recency effect, but it goes back to your situation of behavior, right? How difficult it is in an organization that has a significant play or investment in university athletics to continue to serve that mission versus the mission of how do we reduce ongoing potential reputation risk and threat to the organization, right? I'm sure that what McMaster is spending right now to investigate anti-racism statements, that money spent on lawyers could have wonderfully been well spent teaching coaches and athletic trainers and everything like that to be more aware of their racial biases as well in that period of time. Anyways, that's Jackie, I'll go back to you and then.
Yeah, actually, that's a great segue to my question. And which really was that if you think about those things, a lot of times when we talk about reputation management, we talk about those things that you can do in terms of, governance and, setting, it's the prevention versus the response. And you talked about, at one point, the potential of bringing, having a seat at the table for somebody with academics, which really speaks to me about diversity as well. And I wonder if you could just talk about, diversity and maybe some of those other key preventative things that universities, and this kind of goes to your recommendations and your self-assessment, what are the kind of preventative things and measures that universities and colleges could be putting into their, and I think in this point, although Terry's point about there being differences between college and universities, when we look at the factors that are really going to help these, regardless of what the HEI, size or, background is, there are certain things that are going to help them manage the reputation on this issue. Can you just sort of speak to, if you were talking to the president of the university who heard about this study and said, help me to understand what are the kinds of things I should be looking to see are in place, and go a little bit into that?
Sure. I think I would be encouraging them to understand how sort of internal operations and internal identity and culture translate into actions that end up informing the way that the programs in the schools are perceived. So I think that it comes down to, like you said, looking at what our governance and our structure looks like, to make sure that we have a good lens on what is happening in our environment, so that we are aware of the tension points that can impact our ability to fulfill our mission or achieve our goals. We need to make sure that we have people in place who are able to assess that environment appropriately. And that means in a very simple way, you can't have a whole group of people that are all the same. We need more diversity in the leadership space, in terms of, and this doesn't just go to like an athletics person and an academic person, like, because I don't think that that's, it may have come off that way in the presentation, but it's a lot more than that, right? It's about gender and ethnicity and personal experiences and professional experiences, business experiences that enable the function to bring diverse perspectives into their problem-solving approaches, and more accurately understand what the needs are of our stakeholders on the within and without the organization. And if you set that up appropriately, if you have the right sort of structure, it informs the identity, it informs the culture that we're trying to curate. And again, it's sort of like a self-propelling sort of move. By creating more diversity internally, you're going to be able to make more informed and sort of broader based decisions that are going to impact the external space as well.
We're running low on time, so I'm just going to give you one thought to consider before Jackie and I leave the call and make a final assessment. Is that there is very good information here that you need to share with universities and athletic directors and college athletic directors as well. So I hope you have a very solid plan of knowledge mobilization. Don't I wouldn't let the limitations of numbers hold you back, because I think what you've done is used it as a way to categorize and create a model that is an important discussion point as well. So Jackie, so we need to mute our microphone and our video, and I will call you.
Okay, thanks.
Hold tight.
Sure.
Cheryl, we have returned, we've deliberated. We need more time. So maybe in the next week, we'll come back to you. I'm joking, totally joking. But as an honor to the Royal Blue Society that we have shown up today, I'm going to turn it over to your advisor, Professor Hornweg.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Cheryl, let me just say congratulations on completing your capstone with high honors.
Hey.
And welcome to MCM alumni. And also just wanted to add to that to say that, Terry and I were both very impressed with the work done here. The original thought, the way you synthesized a lot of complicated information, the timeliness and relevance of this topic, all of those things really make this a great study. And I know that I speak for Terry, and he'll probably just say to himself anyway, again, is that we both really hope that you take this and get it out and share it, because it's really important and very relevant and timely information that could be really valued. And, one of the things that for both of us really resonated is the way that you took this topic, this very sensitive topic, and you kept it in that very constructive critique box. So congratulations, just an awesome job all around.
Thank you so much. Thank
and
you.
I'd like to echo that as well, Cheryl. This is a complex subject to begin with. The multitude of layers that you have to kind of deconstruct to kind of get to that. And you need to find a way, and I've asked Jackie to work with you to find a way to find outlets to share this information. Your model should not fall on deaf or unwilling ears, ignorant ears in some respects that don't want to move this forward. And I know that there is a time and place for that. I think you will find some progressive and open and willing athletic directors or deans of students who would accept and really value this kind of presentation as well. So look for those as well. So congratulations. Welcome to the MCM family. The email for donating to the MCM family will come in a couple seconds. Usually just what happens. No, I'm joking. And I want to wish you all the best. Sit back, enjoy the rest of the summer as best you can. Thank your supportive group, not just your MCM cohort, but also your family that have got you across this finish line as well. So congratulations. For those MCM people that are still thinking about finishing off, we have another capstone presentation at 2 o'clock. It's also within the post-secondary education sector. Scott Anderson will be doing his, looking at alumni outreach within the Queen's family. And then on Thursday, Ali will be presenting her capstone at 10 o'clock. That link will go out tomorrow. So if you're looking to connect with us at 10 o'clock on Thursday for Ali's presentation on source credibility within senior populations. Have a great rest of your day. Enjoy and celebrate, and we'll talk later. All the best, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Congratulations.
Bye. Congratulations, Cheryl. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you,
Thanks
Terry.
so much.